Hello. Today we'll be talking about perceived cash flow, Odysseus being strapped to a mast to quell his impulses, the value of owning a BlackBerry phone as a businessman, going from truth seeking as Socrates to the church version of philosophy to a disengaged academic philosophy back to a truth seeking philosophy. We'll talk about writing for the headmaster and why you shouldn't do that. We'll talk about adding a lock to one's door, having an androgynous mind, not being interested in clothes after your company goes bankrupt where you sold clothes, how money dignifies what is frivolous when it is unpaid for, and goods for the sake of ownership over their utility. Specifically, I wanted to group these things together under the umbrella of starting a venture. I think a venture in the modern context is generally starting a business or building a brand, but these things change over time and are very heavily dictated by what a society values. For example, what I just said about perceived cash flow from the shipping man was this idea that, well, it's not actually about the value of the containers moving from port A to port B. It's about the perceived cash flow that a ship can provide over time. A lot of this perception is heavily rooted in signaling and what a society values. So, on the flip side of clothing, Van Clothing, run by Kensuke Ishizu, when it went bankrupt in the 1970s after being a post-war boom kind of fashion economy for the men in Japan, especially through the kind of take Ivy movement in the early 50s, late 50s, early 60s, where this style was imported over. A lot of it had to do with, again, perception of what clothes that young men were supposed to be wearing, perception of what salary men were supposed to be wearing. And as that changed because of America's relationship to Japan in the 1970s through the Vietnam War, as well as through the American occupation ending from the post World War II era, the Japanese style moved over to a more heavy duty cowboy kind of fit, and the Ivy style kind of died with it. And I like this quote a lot. I'm not interested in clothes anymore when the van company went bankrupt, because it shows me that in a lot of ways we are subjugated or almost subject to, once our initiatives reach a certain size, the existence of the world continuing to accept them. I think this relates specifically to the growth of philosophy through the eras. So, as I said, from truth seeking, Socrates used philosophy as a form of therapy to kind of really understand the type of person that he was engaging with and asking them certain questions that would birth truth or get them closer to truth. Truth is unreachable. Socrates was known as the wisest man in Greece because he knew that he knew nothing. But as that moved over into becoming basically a handmaiden for the church, Aquinas, for example, Christian apologists made philosophy into a acceptance of God, into a purpose to continue God's will, as opposed to doing philosophy for the sake of really trying to get at something. It's really trying to get at the same thing, which is God. And then as we moved into like the 16th century, post Galileo, post these kind of big reformations with Locke and Hume, we started to see philosophy become this kind of more disengaged academic discipline where people weren't really actively using philosophy to solve real problems that were practical in their lives. It was this kind of academic talking point, basically, to look good. And then once we get to Kierkegaard in the 1800s, that's when things start to move back towards practicality. I think that this ties to me to this idea of an androgynous mind, which is a concept that was brought up by Virginia Woolf. I wrote a number of things down from Virginia Woolf here. I wrote lock on one's door, don't write for the headmaster, money dignifies what is frivolous when it's unpaid for. And I think that this androgynous mind kind of notion that she brought up of having, for example, a Shakespeare who's able to write female characters, or a female author like an N.K. Jemisin writing about male characters, and having to have an understanding of how the other sex views the world, I think is a part of that perception thing a little bit, right? Like you need to perceive not only what you would do in terms of your own body, but someone who was born into a different body and into a different mind, how they would deal with that. And that ties to me to the Odysseus being strapped to the mast. Odysseus, known as this kind of really masculine character, going on this odyssey with a bunch of strapped men, the Argonauts or no, that was Jason with the Argonauts, take this epic journey and this epic tale. And in order to be kind of held back from jumping into the ocean, he had to be tied to this mast to prevent him from being, captivated by the harpies. And I think that this is, or the sirens, excuse me. I think that this kind of, in my mind, is both obviously related to making business decisions based on whether or not you're just doing it for certain status symbols or doing it because you think it'll make you look good buying a Labubu. I think when it starts to kind of get more hairy is kind of like, how do you make good decisions that people will want to pay for things? And that's not really a clear thing to do, but I think it's easy to latch onto an impulsive kind of thing to do, as opposed to taking the time to really kind of get to the truth of the thing, as we were just talking about with philosophy. So this androgynous mind, to me, concept is specifically as it pertains to having a lock on one's door, is kind of like the notion of being able to be in a space where you're allowed to take the time to have your mind work through things. I really liked A Room of One's Own because Virginia Woolf does a really great job of talking about how important it is for the human mind to have time and money, basically have enough money to solve for these really hard problems, and having a place to write, having a place to think, and then having a place to share those thoughts, whether it's through the medium of an artwork or a business or a framework of being, is important to the growth. But then again, I come back to the I'm not interested in clothes, because if your business goes bankrupt or if people don't like what you're doing, this is from Amatora by David Marks, by the way, then you kind of be like, well, actually I didn't want to do it in the first place, even though you dedicated your whole life to it, which I find to be really interesting. One thing that I wrote here, or two things that I wrote here that we didn't talk about yet, were money dignifies what is frivolous when unpaid for, and goods for the sake of ownership over utility. And so money is interesting because money is obviously partially based in perception and partially based in reality. When you have $20, you can pay for what anything that people value for $20. There's a lot of factors at play. Inflation, for example, what's accessible to you. I just learned a lot from Shipping Man about containers and containerization. There was this guy named Malcolm something, I forget his last name, but he basically created the modern shipping container, which ended up saving the world 10% cost, they guess, on shipping globally, which is amazing, by creating a platform basically for anything to be shipped in those giant kind of shipping containers that can be put on trucks. They call it TEUs. Created a global economy where money is more useful. And I think that something that could be considered frivolous is something that you would see on like an Etsy, for example, or something that's like not really kind of straightforward in terms of its utility that it would provide, but people pay for these things and people pay for them to get shipped globally. I bought a really nice leather journal case from Etsy, and I think that things like just having enough money to kind of get something off the ground ties into the Virginia Woolf having 500 pounds a year from her deceased aunt who died on horseback in Bombay. But where it becomes a problem is where we have goods for the sake of ownership and collection over utility. And I think that we live in a world where that is very much the case, right? Like a lot of the things that people pay for are done to impress other people, impress the idea of other people, going back to the Onassis glasses, going back to the kind of like perception, owning a BlackBerry to show that you're a businessman, kind of wearing the certain suit to sell a particular thing. And I think that this is goods for the sake of their ownership over utility. It's rare to create items, or rather own items that are just owned for their pure utility and the deep value that you get from them. I think someone who does this really well, in terms of using things for utility, but also their beauty aesthetic as a form of utility, is Rajiv Surendra. I'm a big fan of his and his work, and he spends a lot of time kind of finding the deep beauty of the things that he works with. which I think we can bring up to our final point here, which is don't write for the headmaster. Signaling is a very fragile society way of thinking. Signaling only makes sense in a society where the things that people value are what you value. And, you know, you might outlive certain signaling fads, and certain things will outlive you. Certain religions will outlive you. Certain empires will outlive you. But that doesn't, I think Virginia Woolf hits on this. You shouldn't really be writing for other people. She says that women had this tendency to want to be anonymous, and kind of because of the hundreds of years spent child rearing and just working in kind of like very particular fields, because men were too afraid to let them into other fields, specifically like academia and philosophy and stuff, mathematics. It created a certain type of fear of kind of being able to put oneself out there. And I think that what she was trying to get at is that you kind of need to do both. And this goes back to that androgynous mind. You need to have the masculine urge to share yourself and to put yourself out there, but you need to not be so compelled by the signaling status game of it all, of kind of trying to be the alpha, trying to be the big dog, where you can write something that's genuinely for yourself. Because writing something for Oxbridge, writing something for the headmaster, will mean that you're writing something that doesn't last, because it wasn't true. It wasn't true to you. It wasn't optimizing for any particular truth. It was optimizing for the signal that people would like you more. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you like what you heard here, how I was kind of jumbling a bunch of different books, successfully or unsuccessfully, into a third-party topic, I'm doing one-on-one, like, personal training, basically to help people become better readers. So you can find the form for that in the description below, as well as Amazon affiliate links to the books that I was mentioning: Amatora by David Marks, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and The Shipping Man by McCleary. I forget his first name. Okay, thank you for watching.